Seamus, Tommy Sostunish, to be here in York, Lindenhall Library, and thank you very much to Patsy for helping put this together and coordinating things along the way and the planning that she's been involved with on my behalf. I had the great privilege of being a governor of the Lindenhall Library several years back, and one of the elected governors, not long after I came to Belfast. And I had the great privilege of working closely then with John Killen, who I think many of you knew, who's continued his presence in many ways every time I come in. Not just this room permeates this library. It's 10 years ago since we also lost a friend of ours in Seamus Heaney, and it was through John that had put together a publication that the library sponsored on Michael McClary's works. And that Seamus Heaney had launched that back in 2005 here. So we think of Seamus as well. I'll refer to something Seamus wrote, which probably won't surprise you at the end if it works. I'll work on the time sequence we have, but I'll be speaking maybe for 20 to 30 minutes and hopefully take some questions. I'm not the most adept working off these things, but I'm going to go through some photographs quickly and then refer back to them just to give you a sense of what we're covering, who we're covering in terms of Paine, his relationships. That'd be great. Turn it off. Thank you. Anybody else with a phone? Maybe we didn't say that. Any phones? That's great. No problem. Captain Laura, we're good. So I will just working from that refer to and talking about Paine, but in this backdrop of Belfast. By the way, Tom Paine was never in Ireland. He was not in Belfast, he was not in Dublin, unless he slipped in quietly and got away, because if they would have got him, he would have been killed, because he was a wanted man in many places, starting with his native England. He was an Englishman, he described himself as a man of the citizen of the world, and he was all of that. But he had a great impact in Ireland and relationships with people here, which we will discuss. So that back in 1792, within 3 years of the original Bastille Day at the fall of the Bastille, in Belfast was one great celebration, and it was unique in these islands and had an impact throughout this island. Ireland, in many places, celebrated Bastille Day, but Belfast, and we know the background of saying that this rights of man was the Koran of Belfast, and people meant that, maybe people that he knew here, and people not here that had, of course, a great attachment to Belfast themselves for many reasons in terms of the United Irish movement in Wolfe Tone. But so that is what that is. But with respect to the earlier publications of Common Sense, which was really very important to the American Revolution as an intellectual document in shaping the Declaration, as I will go into shortly. But that was from a printing of the document. He was only here just barely a year, here being the United States, of course, it became the United States and the colonies in Philadelphia, just there for just barely over a year when he published this, not in his name. There was reasons for that as well, more attached to just simply being in hiding, but it was a very important call, rallying call that affected the Declaration itself. And that's an etching of Paine from that time. I was happy to have served on the committee.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Am I blocking you? Speak onto the microphone. I appreciate that. No, I'm not trying that. I'm not wondering up here. Just let me know. Put up your hand. Thank you. Can you hear me better now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, folks. Now this is on Barrow Street in Greenwich Village in New York, which is near 6th Avenue. It's a plaque on the wall named after Thomas Barrow Street, an artist who died in 1807, 2 years before Paine. But it was where Trinity Church had a large landowning of property, and a plaque is up there on the street, known as then called Reason Street, in honor of Tom Paine's The Age of Reason. But Paine died at nearby 59 Grove Street. The common usage corrected Reason Street into being Raisin Street. But the church and the community promoted the renaming to Barrow Street. So Reason Street became Raisin Street, but Paine had a pretty good sense of humor and probably would have liked that. But that's a plaque him in the committee down in Greenwich Village in New York City, where he lived. That's Tom Paine Park. Ironically, that's in the federal courthouse, which he had something to do in terms of who later would work there. A man named Thomas Addis Emmett, which I'll refer back to. You will know that name as well, the older brother of Robert Emmett. The Boston Liberty Tree and the Sons of Liberty, 1766, close to the Boston Common was the Tree of Liberty, where they hung images of the crown, the king in effigy. It was taken down and used for sawwood. The poem written by on the Boston Liberty Tree was important to Paine. And I'll refer back to that and how it inspired the United Irish movement. And that's Craig Rowan, the Liberty Tree at Mollusk, which many of you may have seen in your travels. 7 miles from the Battle of Antrim site, from Antrim town, of course, and that's very close to Mollusk, but that is where McCracken gathered on that day in June of 1798 with his division heading for the ready. He was able to put together in the forces that were united in June of 1798 for the Battle of Antrim. So that tree was planted. The tree was not fully grown then, but that still exists, and that's known as the Liberty Tree all these years later. Those are two men of influence to the United Irishmen in a key way. It's separate situations, obviously, and friends, and dear friends to each other. Tone on the left and Thomas Russell on the right. I refer to Thomas Addis Emmett, but his portrait's not here. But we'll come back to that. In the context of Paine's works, we know of the common sense I've mentioned, the rights of man, and then the Age of Reason. But he also had authored a number of major publications that kept the American Revolution going, that was dealing with the crisis. He was also, more than simply, in addition to being a writer, Paine, in fact, was part of Washington's Continental Army, held a actual officer's rank of a colonel to Washington himself. The Stamp Act led to the taking down of the Liberty Tree, the protesting that led to it. But finally, when it was removed, Paine wrote the celebration of the Liberty Tree and the poem published in Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette, celebrating its importance to all Americans, including the common man. He wrote, "Unmindful of names or distinctions, they came for freedom like brothers agree, with one spirit endued, they one friendship pursued, and their temple was the Liberty Tree." When it was removed, Paine was happy to report its good use. It made 14 cords of firewood, about 18,000 cubic feet. And the image of the Liberty Tree that he published in the cover of his book, a lithograph, was something he was quite proud of in terms of wrapping that as a theme for around the world, that on the idea of Liberty trees and how it began that revolution in the context of Boston, which was more than about simply taxation. In speaking of Paine's arrival to the American colonies as an English immigrant driven by what he termed a past of limited achievement and poor prospects for the future, you need to think also of Franklin, who basically found him in his meetings in the coffee houses of London. At that stage, Paine is actually 40 years of age. Franklin is then an older man of 70. And that is in 1774, when he suggests to Paine that he go to America, and had a place for him there in his publishing of his publications, his newspapers in Philadelphia. He covered that passage for him, the promise of work and accommodation on a very rough 12-week voyage. But at a minimum, Franklin can surely be credited as a great judge of talent from the Paine he encountered in the mid-1770s in that London coffee house. Barely arriving at that time in November 1774, He set about dealing with the intellectual issues in promoting the separation of the American colonies from the United Kingdom, or from Great Britain, and from George III. And 8 months later, he would write and publish, at first anonymously, the groundbreaking pamphlet Common Sense. One could imagine the hole that would have been left in advancing the cause of human liberty had Paine had not skillfully advanced common sense, not only for America, but also for mankind. And Franklin had not made his offer. Remarkably, common sense, of course, would have global legs for years to come, especially as the Battle of Wexford took place in 1798. The American historian Henry Steele Commager has described Thomas Paine as the most misunderstood and condemned man of all the great men who won American independence and made the American nation that he gave the name to, in fact, Paine, the United States of America. Born in 1737 in Thetford, England, he died on a small farm he was allotted at the end of his days in New Rochelle, New York in 1809. Later, his bones were disinterred and taken back to England, but were never given a final resting place. There's a song called Tom Paine's Bones about that, and it's on YouTube, that Andy Irvine sings, and it's worth having listened to. He lived to the age of 72, exceeding the average lifespan for males during that time. John Adams, when he was asked, the second president of the United States, but a leading intellectual force himself from Boston, of stating the cause for separation from the crown, he was asked if he had written and published the fiery pamphlet Common Sense early in 1776, which became that basis for studying the revolution. His name is Paine, a gentleman about 2 years from England, a man who General Light Horse Harry Lee said had a look of a genius in his eyes. He was one of Washington's top generals. Paine's pamphlet was written in plain English, with no invocations of the ancient Greeks or Romans. He addressed the ordinary citizens of the people of the 13 colonies more and more to hit its mark. Written by Paine at the urging of some who did not want to take on the task and put themselves at greater risk of treason, it rapidly spread across the American colonies to serve as an intellectual binding agent for the American Revolution, which then had a total population in those colonies of not more than 3 million at the time. And that in itself was an amazing achievement. He cited the Bible, which was known well to the average folk. Andrew Jackson on Paine, who would later defeat John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, for the presidency and became the 7th president, had spoke of Jackson spoke of the ability of Paine reaching the common man. Although Jackson, as we know, is a slave owner and the architect of the Indian evictions from Florida to the Carolinas, with deep roots here in his family home in the Carrickfergus area, not the great epitome of supporting the common man, certainly at the time, at that stage in 1827, 1830s, America brutally did not include 1/3 blacks of the population or the Indian peoples, and that would not be rectified for many years to come. It's still a question of controversy back and forth, even shamefully in terms of voting rights. But he had declared that Paine's rights of man would be more enduring than all the piles of marble that men can erect. But on slavery, it was Paine himself who stood forthright against it. Most of the signers were slave owners. At one time, Franklin did too, and was persuaded against that, the holding of slaves. Shocking to many to know that. Jefferson we know about, and most of the founders were in fact slave owners, except for those like Adams and those in the Northeast states. There was with Paine and Franklin a common bond drawn from humble beginnings, with limited education beyond the age of 11. Without ever entertaining the idea of going to university, he was driven by a hunger for knowledge. But the cause that led him to leave his homeland, where he was unsuccessful in promoting the descent needed there to replace the king and build a government for sovereign people, was what caught root in America. He would later describe himself as a citizen of the world, given the three journeys indeed his lifetime lived across the continent, traversing and spending many years in France, but as a committed anti-monarchist in his native England, to a total commitment as shaper of the American Revolution, capped off by his role as protagonist in the French Revolution, it is fair to accept Tom Paine on his own terms as a citizen of the world. The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of mankind, he said. Many circumstances will arise which are not local but universal, through which the principles of all lovers of mankind are affected. The laying of a country desolate with fire and sword, declaring war against the natural right of all mankind, and extirpating the defenders thereof from the face of the earth, is the concern of every man in whom nature has both given the power of feelings of which class, regardless of party, is the author. And this is part of what affected very much in the cause of the United Irish movement. But in particular, during the most painful hours of battle in the northern states, for much of that revolution, battles were not going well. The French intervened, and the French interdiction at the high seas and drawing a blockade was a tremendous benefit, still often overlooked in the teaching of American history. It looked more likely that Britain would win the war and the colonial leaders would be hung. Paine wrote a series of essays called The Crisis, to convince the patriots to stay the course and continue fighting and to encourage civilian support for independence. In it he wrote, quote, "We fight not to enslave the earth, but to set a country free, and to make room upon the earth for honest men to live in." It had an impact. At the Battle of Trenton, it was a small but pivotal battle which took place on the morning of December 26, 1776 in Trenton, New Jersey. Crucially, Washington's victory there enabled him to cross the Delaware. He had come away what was his Dunkirk. New York, he evacuated, he escaped from New York. Paine's line from The Crisis, dealing directly with what would happen at the Battle of Trenton. "These are the times that try men's souls," he said. Quote, "These are the times that try men's souls," end quote, was directed at the weary troops, who upon hearing the line were heard to shout it out as they engaged the Hessians forces, mostly German that would be, and British forces in combat at close quarters. Famously, Paine went on to write also from that, "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman everywhere." Paine's line, "These are the times that try men's souls," would later be repeated by Thomas Russell and the United Irishmen. I will speak to you now in terms of those engagements and how they developed between Paine and where they were with respect to the United Irish movement. Some of his first meetings took place before Paine and Russell actually met Paine, before Tone would meet Paine in Paris. And they were at a time overlapping the period of time in 1793 where Paine and Russell had not met yet, but where Paine was meeting in Paris with Lord Everett Fitzgerald, the brother of the Duke of Leinster. Unbeknownst to either Russell or Tone, or to many who would become the formal United movement. In 1793, Russell and Tone, both dispirited by the failure of reform for Ireland constitutionally, talked themselves actually about immigrating to America, which for a period of time to Delaware is where Tone went, but not so much to immigrate, but to develop a greater understanding of the American Revolution. At that time, 1793, Tone is 30 and Russell is 26. Tone, of course, will die in November of 1798, and Russell will live till 1803. He's executed in Downpatrick jail. At that stage, he's 34 years of age. But what they did not know at that time, as I said, that Thomas Paine and Lord Edward Fitzgerald, the brother to Duke of Leicester, were both in Paris. And the concept that Paine is stressing as an option is that point in the house of the ambassador, James Monroe, who would become the 5th American president. Paine had a habit like Franklin. If he stayed in your house, it wasn't 3 days. He stayed for a long time. But he was as much in many ways, Monroe would write back to his wife, and he was in the US much of the time, that he could be a source of aggravation, getting him in more trouble than he wanted to with the French regime. But Monroe hosted both Paine and also Tone. And that was a critical link that was also to take effect for Lincoln, but led, first of all, with who it is that is Lord Edward Fitzgerald. Fitzgerald, we know, is killed in an attempt to capture him 2 years before, 1798. He's killed in Dublin in a rooming house, in a firefight. But he had been, in the American Revolution, a British lieutenant. He wanted a career in the army. The family were a loyal family overall to the crown. Irish nobility. He had the title of a lord himself. He would revoke that title when he got to Paris and all things to do with the crown. But as a young lieutenant, he was wounded in the Allegheny area in western Pennsylvania. He was left for dead, but found by, you know the story of Tony Small. He was a young runaway slave, 15 years of age, and found this redcoat moving still. And it was he took him into his own humble tent and brought him back to health enough to get to Barbados, to get to Paris, where he spent the rest of his life, Tony Small did, and ended up in Liverpool himself. And there's a novel written about that that you might track down about. I wish I had put my hand to it, but in fact, it's written by, we'll come back to me, it's not Jim Sheridan, it's the man who produced the Michael Collins film. It's written that book 2 years ago in terms of the, in a narrative fiction, work of fiction. But what had happened during that period in 1795 enormously changed things. It was introducing the idea of separation by Republican revolt, and into the minds of Russell and Tone, the concept of popular sovereignty. And the separation at that stage, when constitutional means were not working by either, certainly not in the Parliament in Dublin, where in fact was the first time that Dublin Parliament is where Tone met Russell, and it certainly wasn't working with the Crown and with the English Parliament. So that was important in terms of where that process takes place. But Paine meets Tone in Paris, and it is through James Monroe that also happened in April of 1797. He meets Paine and writes back to his wife, to Matilda, about his impressions of Tom Paine. He said he liked him almost instantly. Quote, "He is vain beyond all belief, but he has reason to be vain, and I forgive him for that. For he has done wonders for the cause of liberty in both America and Europe, and I believe him to be consciously an honest man. He converses extremely well, better in discussion," he said, "than his writings, whose humor is often clumsy enough." He also said that he had learned that Paine can sometimes get drunk like a fish. In misfortune, I have known that other justly celebrated patriots also succumb to. But the best time to catch him, I find, is late at night, sometimes with a bottle of brandy and a bottle of water. So that's the human side of Thomas Paine. But then again, he wouldn't be alone in those respects along the line of those in public service. But Paine was no plaster saint, but it should be borne and understood, lived at risk throughout his life. He was not simply a pamphleteer, but lived that risk that went with that, on the run often, hunted down, and which is why he left England, and he had the good fortune of coming across Franklin, and most of all Franklin and what became the United States of him. But those dispirited young men then were uplifted in that cause. Paine would later describe himself as a citizen of the world, given those journeys we spoke about. He was appointed by Washington as a major to the Continental Army, and it was as a propagandist he was needed most. As I said, those times of writing about or against the sunshine shoulders who were there during the easier times, but are gone in the heat of battle or when things get tough. But for Paine, he had a special respect for Washington that he held and for the Marquis de Lafayette, who would come at that stage as a French nobleman, and like Fitzgerald would later forsake those titles of nobility. Bastille Day had held a special meaning for Paine, one that brought Europe and America closer to the values of the Enlightenment. When we speak, my friend Fergus Whelan is talking tomorrow at St. Mary's about the Enlightenment movement. Paine knew about Francis Hutcheson, a person from these parts, from Killyleagh, who left because of his particular views in terms of, yes, a man of the cloth as a Presbyterian, but made the point that in this world, in his view, God's work must be our own. To strict interpreters of the Bible, that wasn't something you believed in or should entertain as a thought, but he became known as the father of the Scottish Enlightenment. And in fact, Hutcheson is in fact buried in Dublin. Ironically, the plot where he is in the graveyard of an old churchyard there is near Wolfe Tone Square. Just at the back of the GPO, if you turn beyond Moore Street, heading on the side to Capel Street, you'll find Wolfe Tone Square. And in those walls, you'll find where Francis Hutcheson is buried. He was also, as an Enlightenment figure, his volumes, published in Latin, were read very carefully by Thomas Jefferson. They're in his library in Monticello. But Paine linked with the rights of man, not simply as the author of a pamphlet, but providing the ultimate statement, that rallying cry for the cause of human liberty against hierarchical tyranny. So in literature, there was his own personal involvement. As I said, he risked personal liberty as well as life and limb, putting himself on the line across oceans in what for him was a universal cause. His arrival in America is very important, not simply because of what he does for Franklin, but what is said in terms of the influence for all of the US, in that Jefferson had, in 1774, had written as a Virginian. Before the Declaration, there were all of 13 different colonies, but the idea of unity, it was Franklin who said, we either hang together or we hang separately. But helping enunciate that better was the man, Thomas Paine, disagreeing with what not Franklin's view, but Jefferson. Jefferson wrote for the Articles from Virginia a message of protest to George III on the basis that we entertain, I beseech you, that kind of language. But in fact, what you're getting is what you find in the actual Declaration published. You get a copy of it downstairs here, but the first time it appeared ever in the outside world was the Belfast Newsletter on August 1776, so 5 weeks after it's published in Philadelphia, the Declaration of Independence, where the language is quite clear. This is not beseeching you to do us a favor. It is laying down the gauntlet we're leaving you. In the cause of human events, a nation decides it will join the rest of humankind to its God-given rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. It says, we're going and we'll fight you. That is the basis of common sense. And that leads 4 months later to the Declaration, which in the end, because of the rallying cry's acceptance throughout the 13 colonies, basically took the ground from under those who were more moderate and led to the outcome of the American Revolution and the concept of a continental army, which were really 13 militias. And part of Washington's problem with the Battle of New York, the men of Connecticut stuck with them, but others lagged behind and said, no, our commitment is ended on these boundaries, and having to pull together a force, then getting across to New Jersey, up on the Pennsylvania side. And that Battle of Trenton was very important. But the publication of what he's writing then about the crisis is so important. But specifically, in terms of Ireland, to return to that, you take the Battle of Wexford, for example, and I've mentioned Hutchison, an influence across the waters, these ideas that were Enlightenment about sovereignty, about individual liberty, about thought and science, those concepts that lead to the idea of a republic, not depending on a crown. He referred to George III as the royal brute. I mean, he was blunt in that language, and that kind of language would get you in trouble in England, obviously, at that time. And still, he went back to England after the American Revolution. It was William Blake that said, get out of here, Tom, and helped him get out in an early morning vessel onto France. We never returned back to England again. But Paine's name was known and respected in Ireland, not just among the United Irishmen, but because of the publication of Common Sense and the Rights of Man. This begins, in this story, is that a woman from the gentry in Wexford in August of 1798 came upon a young man who knocked at her door, was offering to instruct the ladies of the house in geography. After battle, she then recounted that she was, quote, walking in the shrubbery near the road. I looked out on hearing a number of horses, and saw that same young man under escort going to jail. He was actually, she said, they found in him, quote, a plan for all our houses, the names and number of the inhabitants, and a copy of Paine's Age of Reason. This was something from the research I discovered, but the ideas expressed in the Rights of Man also permitted the people of Wexford, as united men, to adopt an oath of their own, drawing from Paine's pamphlet. I believe in a revolution founded on the rights of man, in the natural, imprescriptible rights of all citizens, imprescriptible rights of all Irish citizens in all the land. They would end the ranks of privilege by those, it said, quote, who consider the people as an inferior and degraded mass, only made for their convenience or amusement. Later, Paine would join, in fact, help push forward the successful effort with President Jefferson. I mentioned Monroe was the 5th president. Washington was the 1st, John Adams is the 2nd, the 3rd is Adams, the 4th is Madison. Madison refused to get involved after the period of time of the executions and sentencing to 1798 in any effort to agree to take prisoners or have them released to U.S. Rather than deportation for imprisonment to islands and elsewhere. Australia is not a prime place for departure at this stage, as we know, but it led to Jefferson and the intervention of Paine, among others. President Jefferson giving his assurance to the British government that Thomas Addis Emmett and a few of his colleagues would no longer be a threat. Edison was released from prison and came to the United States through the intervention of President Jefferson. After arriving in New York, within 5 short years, Thomas Addis Emmett rose to eminence as that state's Attorney General, winning landmark cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. I mentioned the park for Paine there in New York, or showed that in a photograph. And speaking of that federal court, a 20-minute walk away, a federal courthouse, the original one where Thomas Addis Emmett would later try cases. But a few minutes from that, 20-minute walk away, you will find the resting place of Thomas Addis Emmet, and its mark still there in the graveyard of St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. And if you're in New York and you start to say, well, why is it at the Trinity Church, there's an obelisk monument to Paine and the United Irishmen. Why is that there? He's not buried there. He's buried across town in Thompson Park, but that's one of the things you pick up in the little quirks of history. But he did the spade work, both physical, intellectual, to support revolutions. And speaking of Ireland, he said directly that what the active union represented was more than the suspicion that England will govern Ireland for the purpose, he said, of keeping her low, to prevent her from becoming a rival in trade and manufacture, and will always use that to hold Ireland. This was Paine's judgment of what the active union meant. I'll be taking a few questions in a minute, but I wanted to conclude with something that I've come across in research, what I hadn't shared before from himself, and that would be, put my hand on it there, but it's a letter he writes to his, this is from Thomas Addis Emmet. He wrote to Meriden, solicitor, and I think this speaks to the legacy of Paine, but also the lengths that these men had gone to. Before that release in Kilmainham on December 3rd, 1798, this is just 2 weeks after Tone has died in controversial circumstances, always credited historically by some as a suicide with a penknife. I'm not so sure. The more I look at it in terms of he's left to die for 4 days, no one allowed to visit him, propped up in a pillow, chokes in his own blood, basically. But very suspicious case. Some will say, so what? It's a big so what. I'm not so sure. But Tone took his own life. Ironically, it was Castlereagh who cut his throat with an empty penknife some years later, up in his estate in County Down here. But he writes on December 3rd, he being Thomas Addis Emmet, to his defense lawyer. It's a very human letter, a very touching letter, but blunt in what he's saying. He said, "Dear Meriden, you will probably suppose I am once more to entreat you about the government and its conditions relating to myself and my fellow prisoners. But my present motive is very different and gives me reason to hope I may be successful. I read in the Courier this morning that a friend whose memory I shall never cease to have esteem and love for, Tone, directed before his death that a ring he wore should be given to me. This be true, it is for and if from this intelligence I have received of his affectionate remembrance. He was dear to me. His Majesty's ministers will know that my principles are complete, but I have no ability to be able to realize them. That ring was worn by my unfortunate friend, even though it does contain a lock of General Hoch's hair. He was a French general at the invasion that didn't succeed at Bantry Bay, turned back. That's separate from Humbert's invasion in August of 1798. But he said that could not advance those principles. It is not out of political motives that I wish to possess it, but merely as a token of remembrance from a beloved friend, Thomas Addis Emmet, coming in jail December 3rd, 1798. And sadly, in terms of the idea of an Ireland for Catholic Protestant dissenter, as was the aspiration, and never really improved upon philosophically, in my own view, by anybody else coming up with a philosophy for the betterment of this island. Thomas Addis Emmett, the older brother of Robert, did not succeed in that aspiration, but had to go to the US. There's some consolation in the fact that he did move on in life. I mentioned Paine earlier, Seamus. I'll leave you with this. We knew there's some school, I did, at least from my school in Galway, all those years back when the time of interest rate was on our syllabus. But when he wrote Requiem for the Crappies by Heaney, and what that, written by him as a 24-year-old student at Queen's, that's one of his first published poems. The pockets of our greatcoats full of barley, no kitchens on the run, no striking camp, we move quick and sudden in our own country. The priest lay behind ditches with the tramp, a people hardly marching on the hike. We found new tactics happening each day. We'd cut through rains and ride with the pike and stampede cattle and infantry, then retreat through hedges where cavalry must be thrown, until on Vinegar Hill, that final conclave, terrorist thousands died, shaking sides of cannon. The hillside blushed, soaked in our broken wave. They buried us without shroud or coffin, and in August, the barley brewed out of our graves. On Paine, I'll conclude with this. As far as legacy is concerned, I think there was a great example of what has endured in the world. We celebrate a document called the International Declaration of Human Rights by the United Nations, often more sadly looked upon as something to be looked upon and read rather than implemented. But that goes back to the Enlightenment. It goes back to common sense. I was very happy when you take a look at things like the American Declaration, yet to be fully realized, or the French Declaration of the Rights of Man. The Easter Proclamation, I had a little hand in getting in once, mentioned in the White House by President Obama back in March 2016, commemorating the anniversary of the proclamation. I didn't think he mentioned it 3 times, but he did, in terms of that being a freedom document of cherishing the children of the nation and what that stood out for. My late friend and mentor, Liam Dupuy, wrote about comparing documents of that kind, saying and stressing how that declaration of Easter week, that proclamation still stands the test of time in international context, not just for this island, but for the context of what we have obligations to adhere to, not asking, as Paine did not ask for ourselves what we do not ask for others. But on the legacy, he said, not looking for himself in the wider world, but what it is a nation should honor. There is no such idea existing in the world as that of national honor. This is falsely understood as oftentimes is the cause of war. In a Christian and philosophical sense, mankind seems to have stood still at individual civilization, and to retain as nations all the original rudeness of nature. Peace by treaty is only a cessation of violence for a reformation of sentiment. It is a substitute for principle that is wanting and ever will be wanting till the idea of national honor be rightly understood. As individuals, we profess ourselves Christian, but as nations, we are heathens, Romans and whatnot. I remember the late Admiral Saunders declaring the House of Commons, and that in the time of peace, quote, "The city of Madrid laid in ashes was not a sufficient atonement for the Spaniards taking off the rudder of an English sloop of war." Quote, "I do not ask whether this is Christianity morality. I merely ask whether it is decency, whether it is proper language for a nation to use. In private life, we call it by the plain name of bullying, and the elevation of rank cannot alter its character. It is, I think, exceedingly easy to define what ought to be understood by natural honor. For that which is the best character of an individual is the best character for a nation, and wherever the latter exceeds or falls beneath the former, there is a departure from time in the line of what is true greatness." That's part of Paine's legacy. Thanks for listening, but I'd take some questions if you would have them.
fascinating lecture and.
Hold the mic up, please, sorry. Hold the mic up.
Oh yeah, I like that. Hello. Hello. There we are. Nice and loud now. Yeah, just to thank Frank for such a fascinating lecture, and then our time for a couple of questions. And I'll come to you with the mic if you have a question. So if you just want to raise your hand, I will come to you. You have it very handy.
Hi, Frank.
There he is.
I love that talk. Love that. Thank you so much. I think the confusion about whether Tom Paine was in Ireland was because Lord Edward had a big painting of him in his house for Frascati, wasn't that it? And so people argued when they were demolishing Frascati that he was actually in the house, but it was a painting, right? Can you tell us how Paine, what happened to Paine after 1798 and what was the rest of his life like? Just briefly.
You know, he escapes from France. I mean, he wasn't a question of overstaying his welcome in prison. It wasn't the Bastille, it was the prison that he got out of. I mean, the door was open, there was a fever going on, and someone left the cell open, and he won the lottery and got out. But he had a falling out with Washington over that. People can't hear me. Did he have that? So he ended up writing an excoriating letter to Washington, which basically, can you get him off my back and get him out of Bower Street? But he ends up with a small holding up in New Rochelle, which is a museum for Tom Paine. So he died in 72. He was writing pamphlets and available and never stopped. I mean, he just had not just a creative life, an inventive life. He had inventions also. I mean, one reason when he go back to England, he had an idea of building pontoon bridges. I mean, he was original training in life as a horse maker. That's what his father had done. He'd been a privateer. He'd been a tax collector. He started to really formulate his idea against the barbarity government to the Irish, Joe and Mary, was because he couldn't form some kind of, at least a guild of syndicalists for those who worked in government for basically better conditions, and some kind of that. But he would make his name known in the coffee houses, the tea rooms, and that's where Franklin, near the Houses of Parliament, near the Red Lion, there's a side street there where he would meet Franklin. It's a boarding house, but they would go elsewhere, and that sort of time the older man sizes him up and says, well, what's the story with you? I have no great future. I have a lousy past. I'm hanging in there, but this effort of mine is not successful in terms of changing governments. This is to Philadelphia you go. But the next 35, 40 years of his life are, he makes waves, but he puts himself on the line. But in getting semi-immersed in what I'm doing, I neglected mentioning your show already appeared, I think, in the Failure program. If anybody see Patrick Culligan's show and Wolfe Tone, he's good for you. More will see it. You'll be back. He's threatened to come back. Patrick Culligan is here. That's my son Emmett's a fan, so he subscribed to your philosophy on poem.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Anyone else have a question? Let's see the legit one.
Thank you, Dr. Costello. Do you think the fact that Thomas Paine was born in Norfolk had any significance to his later career? What were the circumstances which made him leave that foot?
He was rural poor. I don't know enough sufficiently of the economy there that it was worse off than other places. He had a very sad life in terms of his wife and died in childbirth, I believe, and he had other relationships, but they were not married relationships. And, he took for London, which I guess many with some ambition would if they could. So what's the distance, Norfolk to London?
100 miles.
Yeah, well, he got there and spent years there, but he, as I say, he did end up as a privateer for a while. I mean, he doesn't leave an autobiography, but he did have that habit of staying a while. If you got into your house, he would stay. But Fitzgerald may have got the painting, but they didn't get. He just wouldn't have lasted long in Dublin. He would have got the Lord Edward Fitzgerald treatment, I think, most unkind. But the story of Tony Smalls in Pennsylvania, what is almost like make the biblical analogy of Paul on the road to Tarsus, but here's this English officer, nobility, young lord, lieutenant, in fighting against the Americans in the Revolution, that Paine is the architect of in many ways intellectually, and ends up beating Paine in Paris. You know? It's beyond bizarre. It shows you how small the world is in its own way. When you think with the Enlightenment movement and how they exchange ideas and mail packets and things that traveled, you know, there's still a wow factor. No matter what technology we look at or regulated by or want to regulate it. These folks, and he was not all for men. He was for the concept of men and women. He was a universalist that way, totally anti-slave. There's so much in the American Revolution, as you may know, folks, is a key player. He's what I call the only ever American prime minister, and that is the man Charles Thompson from Slaughtneil, Maharaj. His house is a little museum there, but he left at 14, indentured servant, ends up in Philadelphia. He would have known Paine, but as the crow flies 30 miles to Van Way, that's where John Dunlop comes, again, 14, 15, indentured servitude boys who leave in Philadelphia. But throughout his life, for Indian rights as well as anti-slavery, profoundly so, and was in everybody's ear when this is wrong. We're going to be kicking this down the road. We should deal with it now at the Continental Congress. But he was the clerk of the Continental Congress and a signature of the Declaration. Again, as Franklin said, you were signing your death warrant when you signed this thing. And the big John Hancock from the middle is a 24-year-old from Boston who says, well, in that case, I'll make it worth my while. So he makes it extra large. Anybody ever hear of Abby Hoffman? I met Abby in 1988. I actually hired him as a guest speaker for the political campaign because it seemed like a good way to get a crowd. So I've come up from Boston today. There's a big edifice of a high-rise there, and it's called the John Hancock Tower for life insurance. Hell, he said, blank, blank, blank. John Hancock was not a life insurance salesman. He was a blank, blank revolutionary. But it's like signing John Hancock. The UN Commission. Abby's no longer with us. Anything else, folks?
I think yeah,
I'll still be here.
We've got time maybe for one more. I'm just conscious it's 2 o'clock now, but I could take one more. Here.
Hello, Brian. Thank you for your talk. You know,
Mr. Doherty, right?
Yes, Mark.
Okay, Mark. Okay.
I'm interested in slavery and anti-slavery and Tom Paine's position on that and what influence, if any, that he had with the founding fathers in at least trying to promote the abolition of slavery.
Just again, I mean, he persuaded Franklin, for one, who had at least one slave in Philadelphia. I mean, Franklin got a bargain, by the way, when he hired Paine. He had him write 5 different names. Looked like he had 5 different writers. He was such a prolific writer, better for the Courier, etc. Other like different publications. But he had the one guy that's writing, but also common sense. It sold 200,000 copies. He never took a penny. I should say this: the 6 pence cost, all of that revenue went to the Continental Army. And that is what he did. He's very important in the Battle of New York. It's he and Hamilton that actually restrained Washington from very much going over the top. He's outraged that men on the East River side, which is called Murray's Hill, on 28th, 30th by East River, are starting to pull back, and the young ones are not fighting, and the older ones are hanging loose. And he takes out his horsewhip, and he's about to lose the plot. He's very upset, and they pull him back and say, "No, General, there's someplace else." Hamilton needed to go up, and that became the Battle of Harlem Heights, which was the escape. In the end, it was a battle they won, and there were the Howe brothers were the generals that were the British generals, and a fog set in, and that helped the Americans get across what we now call the Hudson River. But on slavery, he was as effective as he could be at the time. He was consistent, as was Thompson from these parts, but it took what it was, the Civil War. It was an abolitionist movement here. It was an abolitionist movement in America from all time. Philadelphia was not an easy place to be for runaway slaves. There was quite a recent film about the woman from Boston who was Harriet Tubman, physically involved in battle to free slaves. Philadelphia, they would help to send you back because there were bounties for that. Witness Frederick Douglass, we've got the statue to him. Amazing story. I would urge people to go on YouTube and look up Letter from Belfast. It's a dramatic version of his letter to Horace Greeley. Was put together in a literary form for film to the stage by the Irish Literary Theatre of New York. So if you get a chance, I'm not getting on homework assignments, but I'd say you would really like it if you were able to get Letter from New York by Frederick Douglass, New York Irish Repertory Theatre. It's a half hour well worth spent, but it's quite riveting, that performance. I think that might be it. Is that what we think?
Yeah,
I'll get the hook.
so I think Frank is going to be, I mean, he's obviously still here, so if there are people who wanted to maybe get a quick question with him after the event, please do. Thank you so much to all of you for coming along, but especially thank you to Dr. Frank Costello for such a fascinating talk.